Okay, there is a difference. There is definitely a difference. However, I'll let you decide the level of importance it holds. We're just having a little chat and I'm tossing an idea at you. So I've mentioned a pet peeve before with some writing terminology. They're great for communication, conveying ideas that are otherwise complex with a simple word or phrase, but then I also think the community tends to tunnel vision too hard on the labels. I've fallen into the trap before, but that's a video for another day. Why I bring it up is because I feel the same about the term world building. Fantastic if you're dealing with a world building project where the world is literally crafted from scratch, but when a specific narrative is involved, it almost becomes its own separate thing. And that really is the difference between a world building project and a novel project, that a central narrative is involved and water is wet and the sky is blue. But at the same time, that's kind of like tossing a new sun into our solar system. If you expect nothing to change, you're going to be shocked when planets start burning. Relating it to world building, it's a matter of approach, which got me thinking about my own process. I actually have relatively little experience in regular world building, just creating an expansive world for the purpose of creating an expansive world, building continents, cultures, places, and histories for no other reason than you want to. Maybe you have it in your head that you might use it for a story or a tabletop RPG at some point, but you're just building to build. I rarely do that. I actually have a little something I'm working on. You guys will find out about that when you find out. What I do a lot more of, however, is building specifically for a novel. You can substitute whatever medium you focus on in here. And not to say that regular world building is completely devoid of a story. When it comes to world building projects, there are little pockets where stories can be found in the world of warring nations, a cultural rite of passage, an adventure log. And you can expand those and widen them as much as you want for the story you need to tell. But for a novel project, typically the world is built around the story because the story idea comes first. Even in stories where the idea didn't come first and you started with a world, the moment the idea does come, the moment you start doing both of them in tandem, you'll find that the world shapes itself around the story. And that is what I want. Chase that, lean into it. A world that exists to serve the story but can still be independent of it. Now narratives, stories, they can come in all shapes and forms, and sometimes the world is not a huge part of the story being told. And that's awesome, that's what works with that story. But it's when the intention is clearly for the world to play a significant role in the story, which is usually the case in fantasy genres, and that world falls flat on its face in a sorry attempt to play that role. The world doesn't serve the story in those moments. The narrative makes allowances for the world to enhance the story, but the world itself doesn't follow through. The characters just exist in this hollow environment. And since I mentioned the word and I have brain rot, now I have to talk about Hollow Knight. The longest reign of Hollow Knight as a story doesn't work without hollowness, which kind of goes without saying because the story is about the world. The two are so intertwined, it's hard to say when one starts and the other stop. Every aspect of the world feels like it was created to serve the story. The world informs the characters, informs the plot, and vice versa, everything fitting seamlessly. The endless rain and melancholy of the City of Tears, echoing what once was, the statues in disrepair, the ruins, the physical effects of the infection, built specifically to aid the story of a fallen kingdom, how it got to that point, and the player character's role in everything. Every character we meet informs on this. Every place we go to informs on this. Every new enemy we come across, every environment. It feels so lean and to the point, but at the same time incredibly expansive. But how do we actually do this? How do we create a world that has this degree of synergy with the story? Before that though, I have to talk about today's sponsor, Reedsy. Again, you guys know I mentioned in the last video how I was doing a course from them. Well, that was actually a while ago and I've since completed it. So it really is a lot of hand-holding and walking you through the process of completing your first draft. You know what, how about I just go over some things I really liked. There is the fact that an entire week is dedicated to each topic and then the daily lessons that break down the layers of that topic. It's very structured and organized. There's also the further reading section that points you to articles covering more about the topic that we went over during the lesson, the tailored exercises that you can do after every lesson, the weekly feedback that you can choose to sign up for in addition. There's the extensive library of lives, not just the ones you get to attend weekly as you're doing the course, but also previous lives from before you even registered. In the past few months that I've been doing this, my writing output has definitely increased. They have a word target that you can try to follow, but I absolutely flopped at that. No, I realized what it was the amount of insight that just made me excited to write and try to apply it. It was incredibly fun. If all that sounds like something that you're into, you can check out the description to find out more, and thanks to Reedsy for sponsoring this video. So So I have to touch a little on what world building actually is before we move any further. This might be pedantic, but I think it's an important distinction. I've referred to world building before in my previous videos as an author's eye view over the setting the story exists in, and that definition still works, but that video was more focused on the amount of information the writer reveals about the world and how that information is revealed. But this is focused on the entire approach to building in the first place, and I want to go back to that definition and single out the setting part. Setting and world building are synonymous with each other, but not quite the same. Setting is a term you'll more commonly hear in broader discussions of writing out of fantasy spaces, plot, character, setting. Unlike world building, setting almost necessitates a central story, a set, a place for something else to exist in. And that's the mindset that is demanded, that story-first approach to take everything that world building encompasses and use it to create space for something else. Even in stories where the world itself is a prominent character, like our Hollow Knight example, no matter how expansive the world is, everything that has been built is going to be put in context of that story. That is the lens through which we view all of it. Once you understand that, it becomes a matter of which aspects of world building enhance a story and which ones don't. And so we look at the usual culprits, subdividing our story into its basic moving parts: characters, relationship dynamics, plot points, arcs, etc, etc. And it's not so much looking at every little part of a story as it is being strategic with the places you do choose to look at. It's going to be the most important parts of the story, but also the weakest parts of the story, because a complementary world can do wonders for both. But it's also just going to be where you think is a neat place to showcase an aspect of the world towards a net positive for the story. Which is basically me saying, hey, writing is subjective and every story is its own unique flavor. But rather than beat you over the head with every possible permutation, instead I'd like to show you through an example. The Lies of Locke Lamora. I've talked about this book before, but I'm going to do it again because it's one of my favorites. It's a high fantasy, but not an epic, and it follows Locke, a cocky, clever, competent, charismatic confidence man. Quite a deadly alliteration if I do say so myself. One that gets him into more trouble than his thievery is probably worth. But that doesn't stop him though. He is constantly running cons and scamming people, for propriety's sake if nothing else. And the world, the city of Camor, serves his entire character and the story at large. This Venice-inspired city with canals, alchemical lights, ancient Eldrin glass towers, noble houses with their petty games and politics that turn deadly very quick. The secret peace, an agreement that basically legalizes organized crimes with the exemption that nobility and street officers be left alone. A world that actively conspires against Locke at every turn, yet a challenge that he can't resist. There's that defiant streak that doesn't just let him be a thief, but no, he has to steal from the one class of people that the Lord demands be left alone. The Outer Glass, an aspect of the world left behind by a forgotten civilization, completely indestructible, yet Locke happily decides to break into a safe made of it. There's the fact that most believe in 12 deities, but there's the secret 13, the nameless 13, that reveres thievery almost as an art form, sanctioning Locke's actions and underpinning his entire philosophy. There are a number of other examples, but at almost every turn, the world is staged for that emphasis on Locke's character that he tap dances on the line simply because it can be done, an almost religious rebellion. His character thrives off the world and the story off of him. It works fantastically when picking it apart in hindsight, but it takes a certain degree of scrutinization to pick apart your story, separate the elements of your world, your characters, and your plot, and then play a matching game to see which aspects play off each other. Except that's not how it works. As much as world building with a story involved can make you feel like Iron Man creating a new element, the actual process of figuring it out is more of a spur of the moment thing. At least that's how it's been for me. Something clicks and you find those pairings that make you wonder how you didn't even see it in the first place. As I've said many times before, no singular part of a story is an island. They all feed off each other, playing with different dynamics until they're greater than the sum of their parts. And remember, the world is supporting here, not the leading role. So you're going to look at the character, the plot mechanics, etc, etc, and then those can lead you into how the world can support them. The important thing is that you're constantly looking for those pairings, and when you find them enough times, you start to figure out what your triggers are. With Locke, I was mostly focused on character, but you can insert the world quite literally anywhere as a supporting tool. But you should have guessed by now that whether you're building your world around your story or finding the story in your world, you can still come out with an amazing creative end product. Like I said, it's a matter of approach, and the story can be fantastic either which way. So why is it better to build the world around your story? Well, it isn't. It's about pros, cons, and your preference. Hesitation. When you start from a world, you have a set project. You're constructing this thing as the final product. So when you decide to pull a story or novel from that, you're going to be hesitant to change things. But sometimes a story doesn't work unless you give it free rein to be the best version of itself that it can be. Before a novel reaches its final form, you can cut whole sections, whole characters, whole aspects of the world building, and you've got to be ready to pull that trigger. Again, that story first approach. Except you already have this amazing world you built, which makes you reluctant to butcher some parts of it to serve the story better. Okay, you say, I can get over that reluctancy, but it's not just that. It's the fact that subconsciously, you might not even go there. Throwing away your first, second, third idea is a skill that you learn. To be able to scrap an idea that you've already spent time molding and sculpting in lieu of something potentially better, it's a hard thing to pick up. And it's going to be harder still when you already have this extensive world that you've decided to plop a story into. It's why you see adaptations struggle with canon lore from their original source material and end up changing it a bit, because this new medium necessitates a new style of storytelling, and to best serve that story, things are going to have to change. But it's not sunshine and rainbows on the other side as well. When building to serve a particular story, you have to be careful that that's not all that's happening, that that's not all this world is doing, a place that just exists for the story. Now, it might work in some cases, with really character-driven, character-centered stories that don't focus as much on the surrounding world. Stories where the world has such a little role to play that we can easily excuse when it interacts with the sole intention of enabling the story. But again, I'm talking about stories where the world is meant to play a significant role. In those cases, it almost has to be capable of being its own thing, or at least imply that it can be. And the world that was already its own thing before a story got involved is just simply going to do that better. The reason this matters goes back to something I've talked about in a couple of videos now, which is the issue of contrivance. This happened this way because the story needs it to happen this way, and it's very convenient that it did happen this way, isn't it? It works in some stories and genres specifically, but not most. I don't know if that matters to you, but for me, it almost always pulls me out of the story whenever I come across it, whether it's a world doing that or the story itself. Specifically though, for the world, a good way to offset that is to give multiple dimensions to things. Like back to the Locke Lamora example, Locke is trying to break into an Elder Glass safe. In a different story, Elder Glass could just be this thing that is introduced to be hard to break into, to show Locke's daring nature that he'd even try, and to show his clever nature if he succeeds. But the actual introduction of Elder Glass is as an aesthetic part of the city. Every night, as the west finally swallowed up the sun, the glass bridges would become threads of firefly light. The glass towers and glass avenues and the strange glass sculpture gardens would shimmer wanly with violet and azure and orange and pearl white, and the moons and stars would fade to grey. This was what passed for twilight in Camor, the end of work for the last daylight laborers, the calling of the night watches and the sealing of the landward gates, an hour of supernatural radiance that would soon give way to true night. This is before they even introduced as indestructible, before we then get to the part that actually impacts the story of Locke trying to do this impossible thing of breaking into them. You give an aspect of the world different faucets to run through, have them serve different functions while sneakily sliding in the function that's supposed to serve the story. You do that for multiple aspects of the world, have some aspects that are completely independent of the story, and all of a sudden, the world is looking pretty expansive while being incredibly tailored to the specific story in question. Do be careful though, this is how you fall into world builder's disease instead of actually drafting the story. Once more, you can come up with an amazing story using either approach. It's a matter of what you want to do and what you already have on deck. This was more a closer look into the style of world building a novel kind of demands from you, from a person with a heavy bias. I hope that gave you something to think about. Okay, bye.